it's a lot more rare for someone to like make trades or like do things with their money than it is for them to like, comment, post, click, you know, generate data. But when I think about what technologies will carry us forward and like how will we really bring in the next major wave, what we've observed in Web3 to date is like it's way more fun to build apps with your friends online than it is to build like a single app in a silo. What continues to inspire me is just seeing the ingenuity and creativity of developers in the ecosystem. Because it doesn't all have to be so serious all the time. And I think with that creativity, you actually get innovation.
Hi, everyone. It's Jordan from the NEWFORUM team. NEWFORUM is a community podcast that invites purpose-driven leaders, visionaries, and creators to spark accessible conversations on the topics of crypto, the metaverse, NFTs, and everything Web3. Today, we're very happy to have as a guest Micheal Sena, co-founder of 3Box Labs and one of the inventors of the Ceramic Network. So we will learn more about data composability, Ceramic's vision, as well as his general thoughts on the current Web3 landscape. So welcome, Micheal, and let's start if you're ready.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jordan.
So Micheal, you're an OG in the space. You co-founded and you were actually a product lead on Uport, which is one of the first platforms for decentralized identity and self-sovereign data. How did you get into Web3? Like, what's your personal story?
Oh, wow. Yeah, going back a little while. Yeah, as you can see, I have my crypto native hat on. But yeah, so I guess my journey into crypto really started with like, you know, a naive question. I think it was like 2015 or early 2016. And I was trying to I was working on a web personalization project. So basically trying to figure out like, how could we make the web a more intimate, personalized experience for end users? And, you know, sort of just naively asked myself the question, like, well, why can't, you know, I take my data around the web? Because if I could, then every website could sort of mold and shape its experience to me, you know, sort of like I wouldn't have to be a stranger until I did enough things on the platform before that platform came to know who I was, what I liked, what I didn't like. And so, yeah, it was sort of just like, you know, that question that led me to dive back into the crypto rabbit hole. I had initially researched Bitcoin in 2011 as I was a global macro trader at Barclays. But obviously there weren't too many people building that many interesting things on blockchain in 2011. And so fast forward back to early 2016, we had Ethereum. And so sort of like dove back in, realized that there was now finally like a general purpose programmable platform where you could do all sorts of things and build all new types of applications. And sort of like my mind just like unlocked. It was like all of these things that I had sort of like thought about, considered, but like put aside as being like, oh, that's impossible, or like there's just no way to do that, instantly became possible. After that experience, I like did everything I could to just work in crypto full time, which led me to Consensus. You know, they were based in Brooklyn at the time, and they were really like the only company, you know, traditional company doing anything at scale in the crypto space that wasn't like a big bank. It was like Barclays had like a blockchain research lab and like, you know, these big banks. And I was like, well, that's where I had come from early in my career. And I quit because I thought that they weren't innovative enough. I really wasn't about to go back there. And so I found myself at Consensus, and I, you know, joined and sort of like brought together some of the folks working on decentralized identity there, which obviously is sort of that the key primitive that can unlock the data composability or like the data portability thing that sort of drew me to the space to begin with. So yeah.
Sorry, Micheal, I'll stop you there. So you mentioned innovation and kind of the intimate web. So this is what led you to co-found or to be an inventor of the Ceramic Network. Like at what time period was this compared to your journey into Web3?
I like to think that Ceramic is largely just a progression and a continuation of initial ideas that we started at Uport in 2016. You know, like Uport was one approach to user-centric data composability that, you know, was sort of appropriate for the time period in which it existed, which, if you can think back to early 2016 in Ethereum, it's like people are just doing ICOs. Like people aren't building real dApps. Like there's no need for data. And so it was a very different product then. And as we sort of built and grew with the Web3 ecosystem and sort of like stayed in close contact with people that were doing interesting things, we learned a ton. And so I would say that we went from Uport and then we created the 3box SDK as our second product. And that became the leading way that developers could simply drop in, user profiles, messaging and chat and private storage to their application that worked with, your normal Web3 wallets like MetaMask. And then sort of we realized the limits of the system we built. And with the 3box SDK, it was really all about, this was 2017 or early 2018, it was all about simplicity. And so we vertically integrated a decentralized data stack and just gave really opinionated, simple APIs like set profile, get profile, like set message, get message, and so it became, we wanted to drop the barrier to entry for people to add these types of features to their app. But then we sort of realized the limits of that sort of simplistic approach and naive approach to sort of API design. And so we realized that we needed a much more robust, scalable, configurable base data layer on which you can build all sorts of things. And so sort of that's the idea with Ceramic now, and largely sort of serving the same need in the market, but learning, sort of being the product of 6 years of learning and building right alongside our customers.
So one of the key visions or mission statements of Ceramic Network is data composability. Could you briefly define what is data composability, and more importantly, actually, why is it important? Sorry for the repetition of the word, but why is data composability important?
I think sometimes the best way for me to answer that is to just sort of compare it to other concepts that exist in Web3 and blockchain, right? So I think one of the big unlock moments for end users, sort of like anyone that's using a blockchain app, is that I can go to one app and I can buy tokens or collect assets and sort of build up some kind of financial value. And then I can go to a completely unrelated application and I can sign in with my Web3 wallet and those assets magically appear. And it's sort of that financial composability, the composability of assets across apps, that is that first aha moment, I think, for a lot of people, that Web3 and blockchain really, it sort of untethers you from the centralized institutions that we're typically used to engaging with online. And I think as people start to sort of get a taste of financial composability, then they sort of think of well, if I'm also creating a profile on this app, or I'm also sending messages or following users, why does that data not transfer to the other sites like my money? And so it's sort of the ideals behind blockchain and decentralization are user sovereignty, control, self-custody, portability, not being trapped in, under the control of a single provider. And all of those things are still true, and equally probably more true with data than they are with money, because when you think about sort of the volume of interactions that a user takes on any given platform, it's a lot more rare for someone to make trades or do things with their money than it is for them to comment, post, click, generate data. And so sort of the volume of data that they're generating is much greater than money. And so the idea is really that all the things you do online, what you say, who you follow, the content you produce is never locked in and is instead stored on an open system that can be universally accessed by any application.
Right.
And so that's the idea.
Right, because it's true. One of the observations in the space of a lot of people is that it's very fragmented and siloed. So can you give a couple use cases of projects that are using Ceramic Network or part of it? And how were you able to convince them? Is it because you already knew them before? Because I think with new projects, especially you're describing in 2017, how did you onboard people on this kind of simplified experience, but that is still focused on data?
So it's an interesting question. And I think at different stages, of our journey, it's sort of been a slightly different reasoning for people to onboard. But I guess if we talk about who the biggest users of Ceramic are today, I would point to Gitcoin sort of as being like one canonical example of what's possible. If you're unaware, Gitcoin is basically like a funding platform, more or less.
Dramatic funding.
People,
Yeah,
exactly. So you can like post, an idea for your project or post your project, and then sort of the crowd can fund you. And there's sort of some matching algorithm that happens, which makes it really important that Gitcoin has strong anti-Sybil protection, because there's sort of like there's a strong incentive for the system to be gamed so that you can receive more rewards in the process. There's a financial exchange, and so Gitcoin goes through a lot of trouble to like do certain identity verifications to build up sort of anti-Sybil protection for any given user. And Gitcoin wanted to, as they sort of DAOified themselves and went from sort of like a centralized company to like an open community, they really wanted to sort of open up these verifications so they could be more broadly used throughout the Web3 ecosystem, not just like within the Gitcoin platform. And so at that point, they really had two options to make their data open and sort of like more consumable to other apps, more composable to other apps. And that was either one, like open a public API on their server. So like they have a server database that stores all of these like user credentials and verifications that they performed. And other apps can like integrate that specific Gitcoin API, obviously, which creates a centralization vector on that server. And if Gitcoin ever decides to shut it down, or if that server gets attacked, like that data is inaccessible. Or alternatively, they could have sort of like given it to the users and let the users store it and allowed other apps to sort of access it via the user in that sort of user-centric composability way. Ultimately, they chose the latter, for all the reasons that we just talked about, and sort of the technology they used to do that was Ceramic. And so now Gitcoin is storing all sorts of identity credentials called Gitcoin Passport with the user on Ceramic. And now there's like an ecosystem of apps that are consuming that Gitcoin Passport data in their own applications, creating like an ecosystem around the Gitcoin data model, like the models in which they're storing the data in Ceramic. So I would say like it's not only a Gitcoin in this ecosystem, but there's sort of like a whole collection of, I would loosely define them as reputation applications. So there's like disco.xyz, which is another sort of like verifiable credential platform that uses Ceramic. There's like Idential, and so there's a whole bunch of people building or sort of like producing and consuming composable identity and reputation related data.
I wanted to take a quote that you wrote, I think, a couple of weeks ago, which is the data model of Web3 is a graph. So when you talk about this graph, like how do you see it? Because usually when we talk about graphs, we think of like social graphs, knowledge graphs, but you said a graph, you didn't say the graph or anything else. So how do you view it? And how does this interact with not only Ceramic, but also the other actors that you just mentioned? I mean, I guess you can continue your thought because you were kind of going in that direction.
The way that I think about it is, when you build an application, fundamentally you have to decide what is my data model. Like, if you're building a Web2 app, you're using a database, you need to think about like, is my data model like relational tables? Is my data model like NoSQL objects like documents? Is it graph, and which is sort of like some kind of a hybrid between like SQL and NoSQL? And so each of them are good at certain things, and you really think about like is it easy to write to this model? Is it easy to and perform it to query data from this model? And so like when you think about how your data is stored, you also think about how it's accessed. And so in this sort of like Web3 model where you have a user that sort of goes from platform to platform or from app to app and does a bunch of things, and everyone's trying to like read their data and write to their data. And you think about the type of applications that people are trying to build on Web3 today, like decentralized social networks, identity and reputation systems, contribution platforms like DAO tooling and stuff like that.
In the best case, you're giving the best applications possible for sure.
And so, if you were to sort of say, okay, how would we build this application in Web2? I think in a lot of cases you would use a graph database, right? Like to build a social network, like it's a highly relational data model where there's a bunch of relationships between comments and posts and users and so you really like that's sort of why graph databases were invented. And also if you think about sort of identity and reputation, it's really like a new way of saying like 360-degree view of a customer, right? Like it's sort of like this 360, like all these different points of information are connected to this one user. And like, what can you determine or deduce from that information? So, reputation systems, identity systems typically lend themselves better to graph data models. And same thing with sort of like contribution graphs in the same way that like a social network is better as a graph model. You can also look at knowledge graphs and DeSci and all sorts of things, Wikipedia, like these aren't things that like fit neatly into tables with a whole, because imagine like you would need to join a whole bunch of tables together, like sort of that gets pretty cumbersome. And so the natural way to express this data is a graph. And so, unlike in Web2, where like each application would have its own graph, sort of you can, like, I think of Web3 as sort of just one unified graph that every application picks and chooses like which points of that graph they want to interact with. But, in effect, like whether you're building DAO tooling or identity and reputation systems or social networks, you're plugging into the same graph. And so really like identity data created by an identity or reputation app can be reused in a social network or like sort of a knowledge graph. There's no like boundaries between these graphs. It's sort of just one ever expansive. Yeah.
Right. It's kind of the idea of a plug and play into the graph. You take what you want, you get your intimate experience, the simplicity of Web3 at the same time. So I wanted to continue this discussion with another quote that you said. Sorry with the quotes, but they're very relevant to the discussion. You said, and it gotta finish the composable graph database that's gonna save Web3 from only ever being a casino. And obviously this tweet is, you could say, half meant as a joke, but at the same time, there are very real elements to it. And I wanted to hear your thoughts about how do you educate people in the space, not just partners, but also when you look at the general landscape of crypto and Web3 right now, there's, well, maybe not in the bear market as much, but there's a lot of this casino aspect, right? So how does Ceramic Network and you yourself interact with these elements? Do you try to educate the people that are in the casino to come to Ceramic Network? Like how should a new user discover Ceramic Network and kind of avoid the pitfalls of the casino in a way?
So you're right. I did. The tweet is sort of like meant half as a joke with some truth to it, right? And so I think there's a couple of things going on here. One is that, largely I would categorize like the whole wave of crypto adoption that's happened from the ICO days of 2016 through DeFi yield farming in 2020. And then like 2021, you have all these like new token models. I would largely categorize this whole wave as sort of being the financialization phase. Like a lot of the applications, trading related, betting, even like art and NFTs in some ways is sort of like the financialization of like art and creative works. And I do think there's a ton of power in that, right? So I'm not like sort of discounting and saying like the casino is inherently bad. I think like any new technology goes through this phase of like, massive financial interest, which attracts a lot of developers. But when I think about what technologies will carry us forward and like how will we really bring in the next major wave, financialization almost like has its limits, right? Like you get to a point where you've attracted like all the people that you could attract to this, like gambling, betting. Not everyone cares about just making money. People like ultimately, I think a large majority of the world just wants to live their life, right? And like use things that they love. And it's not about that like making money aspect. And so I think about, either there's two waves of adoption to come next. It's either like these financial apps that have largely just been like a thin interface on top of a smart contract or two. And they'll need to become much more robust with more features and data. And whether that's like KYC information for users, sort of like maybe like decentralized exchanges, like DEXs are kind of heading in that direction now, like requiring certain KYC. And so like all of this information like kind of needs to live somewhere, be used and reused in all these applications. And so I think for even some of the most financialized use cases of blockchain will have a greater need for data, sort of like moving forward to make them more compliant in this new regulatory regime, which is popping up as a result of sort of a lack of regulation and a lack of clarity from the previous phase. But I also think there's like a whole generation of developers and applications yet to be created that aren't really financially based at all. They're like, I think sort of like decentralized social networks are like a glimpse into that future, but a large majority of the web is not financial. Most of the web is consumer applications built on data-rich experiences that like Web3 has not even tapped into yet because there hasn't been the technology to do so. And so, when we think about enabling both of these use cases, net new apps that have yet to be invented and previous applications that need to evolve to stay relevant, they kind of need a drop-in database that they can store and retrieve information from, which plugs in and connects to this graph that we just talked about. And so that's really what we're working on. And it's called ComposeDB on top of Ceramic. So Ceramic is sort of this base layer. ComposeDB is a graph on top of Ceramic. And yeah, that's sort of been our product focus for the last 6 to 9 months.
And so you mentioned obviously last year during the bull run, how do you bridge kind of or learn from what happened last year? Because obviously you have the plug and play into the graph approach, but also when it comes to user experience, one of the main, I would say, issues in the space that a lot of people are observing is it's very hard to plug and play into Web3 if you're not like native or have really explored the space. So what are your thoughts? Obviously there's no perfect answer, but how can you bridge these newcomers that are not necessarily there for, as you mentioned, to make money, but that are curious about the tech, that want to learn how to maybe better control their information, their data, that want to interact with this new tech stack, but that don't know how, either a developer or even a new user? How do you think we can bridge?
Yeah, so I think of them sort of as like those two buckets, developers and end users. Like I think, at least some of the things that we're working on, like I really would love to make the developer experience begin with a journey of that looks a lot like, browsing a marketplace and going shopping for data, right? Like in my mind, and based on what people have said, like, and what we've observed in Web3 to date is like, it's way more fun to build apps with your friends online than it is to build like a single app in a silo. Like, you don't have the data to plug in, like you got to do everything yourself. You're like, you're inevitably competitive with everyone else. Whereas like in Web3, it's like, let's all pull in each other's information and like, let's build stuff and that kind of works together. And, and that sort of mindset, we can like apply that now to databases, and the developer experience that we want to create looks a lot like, oh, I want to build a new blogging platform. Well, let me go shopping to see what kind of blogging data exists in the world. And I'll click and, like, oh, I want like all the blog posts that are out there, like all the social graphs that are out there, like all the profiles.
Kind of like a WordPress, right? But for data, for developers, right? Some projects are starting to explore that avenue, but we don't yet have that ecosystem in place where anyone can just come and plug and play, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And in my mind, like, then it makes it so much easier to build apps because you're not, now you don't even need to worry about like acquiring users or populating your app with data. Like from day one, from the go, like you're plugged into a fully composable data set that you just like use to generate your app. And, if you even take that a step further, like really what we've seen in Web3 too is sort of this copy pasta front end, framework where like you can pretty much, because the back end is completely abstracted, whether it's through like a financial blockchain or like a data platform like Ceramic, you can just like copy and paste someone's front end and change some stuff. And like now, not only do you have a front end that works, but you have a fully populated database that also works. And so like, I think you'll sort of see the barrier to development drop dramatically, which enables people to be more creative, right? If it's like easier to make something, then you don't have to make something so big. You can make like micro applications and they can be fun because it doesn't all have to be so serious all the time. And I think with that creativity, you actually get innovation.
It's a great point that you just mentioned, like, having fun and being creative in the space. Because, when you talk to a lot of developers, or even at DEF CON in Bogota, I mean, one of the comments that comes back is, well, it's fun to be in Web3 because you can experiment on whatever you want, which is not that you can't do that in Web2, but it's not as easy. So what's 2023 going to look like for not only you personally, but also Ceramic Network? Anything that you're like excited about?
For ceramic, we've got some big deadlines and dates coming up. I would say that the first one on our radar is ETH Denver. Obviously like a huge event for the community and ecosystem every year. We're a premier sponsor this year, and we'll have some big announcements to make with regards to ComposeDB, going from sort of what's been a developer preview and a closed alpha to a more open beta where people can actually build with this graph on Ceramic mainnet. And so like that's coming up really soon.
And also, sorry, I don't want to cut you there, but the opportunity to shout out your talk actually from last year's ETH Denver on data composability and Web3 apps. It's a 15-minute video, but that's very clear and it goes in depth. So they want to cut you there, but I think it's important for anyone that wants to dive a bit more in detail to go watch that video.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I'll be giving at least one more talk this year. And we'll hopefully sort of like expand on some of those concepts and make them, hopefully even a bit more clear with a whole nother year of learning under our belt. And so I would say, yeah, ETH Denver's big, and then post ETH Denver, which is going to happen the last week in February, first week in March, we'll really be working on, scaling and, further decentralizing the ceramic ecosystem. There's, some work that we need to do to the underlying platform, as we've now like exploded in usage, and it's sort of like making sure that the network continues to run as advertised and can withstand the additional demand. So there's a ton of work to do there. And of course, there's an ever ongoing quest to make the developer experience as easy and seamless as possible, to our point before. So we'll be doing a lot of research. We'll be doing a ton of like experiments with DX, and ultimately just trying to figure out what people want to build and how can we enable them to do that. And in some ways, like when you build like underlying infrastructure like Ceramic and then a use case on top like ComposeDB, and then application developers build with ComposeDB, there's sort of this like infrastructure application cycle that happens, which is well advertised in the blockchain community, like new infrastructure begets new apps. But it's even like a microcosm within Ceramic of like, as we create new functionality, we can onboard new apps, which then demands that the underlying network can scale more. So then we work on scale. And so we always sort of like strike this balance between new functionality and scale to meet the new demand. So that will sort of be the story for 2023.
And so one of the final questions is, outside of kind of this composable data, what is your guilty pleasure in Web3? It could be anything, DeFi, NFTs, gaming, or whatever.
I think my guilty pleasure is probably following too many of these like meme trading accounts on Twitter. I was like pretty early into NFTs, but as like the whole NFT thing like really blew up, like we were so focused on what we were building, there was just like no way that I could keep up with everything that was happening. It's like easy when you're early because you can like keep up with the pace, but then as soon as they start to catch on, it's like, oh, that's outside of our lane, and it's like too hard to keep up, and I'm not going to do it as well as other people. So there's some people on our team for sure that have been big into NFTs and have been big into DeFi. But obviously, I think sort of like the circus that is crypto Twitter today itself is like my guilty pleasure.
Yeah,
it provides a never-ending source of entertainment. Yeah.
Fair enough. Do you have any final thoughts, Micheal? Anything, recommendations, something that inspired you lately? If you want to do any shout out to anyone?
Yeah, I mean, what continues to inspire me is just seeing the ingenuity and creativity of developers in the ecosystem. It's sort of like where I'm most plugged into, and we currently have an ongoing like kind of like alpha grants cohort. We're like piloting a grants program that's kind of closed for this round, and we'll like, if it goes well, we'll open it up in the future. And just seeing the ideas and sort of like skills that people are bringing to the table and really pushing the boundary of like what Ceramic can do and what people want to build on it. Like people are doing things that we had imagined, wouldn't come for years. We were like, oh yeah, like sort of like the general adoption curve will follow this path, and like 2 or 3 years down the road, we think people will start to build these things, or will really get that vision and start to bring it to life, but it's already happening. And so I would just say like what's inspiring is just like how Web3 unlocks sort of like collective creativity, because like everyone pushes each other unintentionally, right? Like just by building within the same domain and everyone being so open about what they're doing and why. I think, sort of like the currency of ideas in the space is super valuable.
Definitely the creativity. I mean, thank you so much, Micheal, for being part of today's episode. Of course, links for Micheal as well as Ceramic and 3Box Labs will be in the description. If you want to get more involved in our community, make sure to follow us on our social platforms. So on Twitter, it's NEWFORUM_NCO. Yeah, take a moment. Don't forget to share, like, or subscribe. It's very appreciated, and have a great day.
Thank you.